65 million years ago, dinosaurs fled the Earth to avoid an asteroid crash. 65 million years later, one dinosaur returned, only to discover a planet ruled by humans. And what a mess those humans have made. My name is Artius Zeradar. After pledging years studying the absurdity of the human race, I determined to right the wrongs of this inferior species by exposing its flaws. This is the Artius Zeradar Show. Alright, this is Artius Zeradar. Welcome back to the Artius Zeradar Show. Today we're continuing on the critique of psychology, which is going to be a series of several videos. So we'll be on this topic for a while. But today's discussion, I think, is probably one of the more interesting discussions. I think this is the one that I've been really looking forward to. The discussion of categories. In psychology, there are a great number of categories. There's a lot of discussion about categories. The DSM-5, which is I guess you could call it the Bible of psychology. It's the list of disorders for clinical psychology, clinical psychologists and clinical psychology, I guess you could say generally. And it's a book of categories. And I need to remember to come back to this again because I'd like to actually open up the DSM-5 and talk about that a little bit, how it was made. If you read it, it explains how it was made. There was a bunch of committees that made the DSM-5. They didn't do a giant experiment. They had committees. That, I think, should make you think a little bit. That sounds like politics more than anything, more than science, but okay. So it's designed by a committee. But yeah, let's examine the nature of category and why the study of category demonstrates one of the biggest weaknesses of psychology. So, categories, the study of categories has probably been with us, I imagine, since the dawn of the human species, because the very nature of human thought is categorical. And those of you who've studied artificial intelligence know that the neurons themselves are built such that they can categorize. So the human brain has the ability to categorize. That is fundamental to human nature. And we learn categories at an extremely young age, kindergarten. So I'm going to begin with the Greeks and their study of categories. They're probably, I presume, the earliest, well, at least in Western civilization, they are the earliest thinkers regarding this thing called categories. So categories begins with, well, I guess, I don't know if it begins, but at least our most dominant philosophers are Plato and Aristotle. Both Plato and Aristotle talked about this realm of idea. Plato especially talked about this notion of idea. And when we think of idea, I guess we usually think of as something existing in the mind. So an idea is not material. It's not in the external world. It's in the mind, or at least something separate or beyond the material world. And there are some philosophers who would argue that idea is beyond the mind itself. So categories deals with ideas. Aristotle's book on categories deals with the realm of ideas. So there is a book Aristotle wrote called the Organon. He didn't organize it into this book, but he is the writer of the Organon. and it's a book of logic, and one of the early books in that, in the Organon, are categories. So I think it's right to attribute the study of categories to philosophy. So instead of jumping deep into Platonic and Aristotelian philosophy, I figured, why don't we just jump in discussion ourselves? What is a category? What do you think a category is? Probably you're thinking to yourself, it's some kind of grouping, some kind of way of organizing particulars. That's usually what we think of as a category. I would agree that's probably what a category is. And again, this idea of category is a place in the mind, because you can categorize particulars in the mind as well. So the actual things in the world, like a ball or a mouse or a tree, these are particular things, but in the mind, there also exist images of those things. So the mind, there is a ball in your mind, there is a tree in your mind, there's a mouse in your mind. You can create these ideas in the mind. So you don't need the material world to understand these ideas. And moreover, the category can group these ideas. So yeah, I guess the category you could say is maybe a grouping of things. Maybe something that describes a large number of things. Something like that perhaps might work for a category. Let's go with that for now. Does a category exist? So this is kind of the ontological question. Well, can you touch a category? So I can touch an apple, but can I touch the category apple? Well, no, I don't think I can. I can touch a group of apples, but that's still not the same thing as touching the category apple. So this really kind of shows us that I think category is an idea. And then one might say, well, then categories don't exist. I can't touch the category apple, therefore the category doesn't exist. However, that's the material world. In the mind, the category most certainly can exist, I would think. Well, you can debate me if you want. I'm open to hearing a debate on that, but it seems to me, well, maybe I could debate myself if I can come up with a counter to that. I mean, yeah, I guess I'm describing the essence of things, and it's not just to say a group. So I could group things arbitrarily, right? I could create a random group of items, but that wouldn't be a category. A category is a group with a particular attribute, I would think. So the attribute itself is kind of essential to the category. And that, well, I guess it exists in the mind. And that's up for debate. Maybe someone wants to counter me on that. I'm certainly open to hearing that argument. And I mean, it's a difficult thing to argue. Let's look at the apple and the category apple. So is there a difference between an apple and the category apple? The apple you can touch. Again, I kind of went over that before. The category apple, someone might say, well, if I had all the apples in the universe and I put them together, then I'm touching the category apple. But even then, I think what you're doing is simply touching all the instances of an apple. So here I think we can see our first distinction between the category and the particulars. Particulars, they can exist in the mind. You can have particular ideas of things, but material things are particulars, and categories aren't. Categories are something in the realm of idea, something that is non-empirical, I guess you could say. If you're into computer programming, I'll speak to you guys right now. I think of all the people in society, computer programmers are actually the easiest, or I guess you're going to have the easiest time understanding the notion of some of these philosophical concepts. And the reason why that's the case is because of the structure of object-oriented programming. So if you're familiar with object-oriented programming, you'll know that what you're experiencing there is you create a class first, right? So if you're used to C# or I think Java is the same. You create a class, and then you can instantiate instances of the class. So the class is kind of the idea of the object, while the actual instantiations are the particulars. And that's the same idea, I think, that Plato asserts too, that there is the idea of something, like the idea of the apple, and then there's the actual particular apples themselves, instantiations. So, yeah, interesting. So we're looking at what is the category? Does a category exist? It would seem so, something beyond the material. Does the category cause the particular to exist? Or does the particular cause the category to exist? I don't want to get into this too much. This goes over my head a little bit, I'd say, too. My understanding is that there was a disagreement between Plato and Aristotle on this. I think Plato argued that categories or ideas cause particular. So what makes an apple exist? And why is it that there are multiple apples in existence and they all have a similarity to them? They all have something in common. If they all have something in common, I guess the argument would be that the category themselves, the category itself, category apple, causes the apples to come into being. It is the cause behind them all. Without the category, there is no instantiation of apples. I don't know, that's really hard to comprehend. That's the argument I think that is typically made, though. On the other hand, there's the view that the apples existed first as particulars, and the idea or the category emerges from the existence of the particulars. So only after the individual apples can we have the creation of the category. So again, this is an interesting thought experiment. I don't want to get too much into it for the purposes of this discussion. I might come back to it another day. Let's get to the more practical question. How do we determine if a particular belongs to a category? Now, this sounds pretty easy, actually, and that's going to be part of my point here. My thesis for today is to point out how simple this really is. Well, think about it. So if I have, let's pick an interesting category here. Maybe the category of shocking behavior. Something shocking behavior. How do you determine if someone's behavior is shocking? So if someone were to take off their clothes in public, it seems like that would be shocking. Well, how do we determine that? Well, we have to figure out what the word shocking means, right? Okay, interesting. So step one in determining whether a particular belongs to a category is to figure out the word, the definition of the word shocking. So we've got the word shocking, and then we got to figure out the definition of that word. Aristotle goes into this a little bit. This is really essential to the way they thought back then, and I think I would argue this was the way we should think today too, is with very great precision as to the nature of categories. We'd have to come up with some kind of definition. So I don't know. Definitions are somewhat semantic, right? Semantic meaning there's not something to debate. It's almost arbitrary. It's kind of what we just decide. So I could use the word instead of the word shocking, and we just all have to come to an agreement as to what that means. So this is kind of an English discussion, right? A language discussion. The word shocking, I guess it means something that causes surprise. I hope that's not too synonymous there. Shocking is something that alerts your senses such that you have a strong emotional response. That may not be the best definition, but we'll go with that for now. If that's the definition of shocking, then we look at the action of taking your clothes off in public. Does taking your clothes off in public cause some kind of reaction to the senses that you are suddenly kind of alerted and surprised? I can't remember exactly how I just defined it just now. I should get my definitions right, get my definitions clear. But that's the method, right? So you just determine whether that belongs to the category shocking or not. Let me go a little bit simpler for a moment, because I obviously I kind of lost myself in the definitions there. Let's just say it's something political. So political usually meaning, and we'll go with the modern definition of political, something relating to power and government, right? That's typically what political means, at least in layman's terms. So is a presidential election political? Well, a presidential election is for the purpose of determining who is the most powerful person in the country, and it is a person in government. Therefore, it is political, right? So we can see that the particular, we look at the definition of the particular, we look at the definition of the category, and then we see if the particular belongs to the category. That's the method of categorization. Now, I think that's the way it works every time, right? I mean, it's not, there's no other method. I mean, if there's another method, it might be a similar method. But that's basically the method of determining categorization. And I'm mentioning that, I'm trying to be very clear on that right now, because I'm going to come back to this later to point something out. All right. Is this an empirical determination? Is the determination of the category empirical? So I'm sorry, I'm not even talking about whether something belongs to the category, but rather the existence of a category. Is that empirical? So one might say, oh, well, it is empirical. See, I'm measuring what things look like, and I'm looking at the way it behaves in the material world and deciding whether it belongs to the category. But again, I'm talking about the category themselves. How do we determine whether the category exists? So if I want to determine that the category humorous exists, how do I determine that the category exists? Not the instances of humor, but the category itself. We're looking at something in common, I guess, in all these things, and so in that way it seems kind of empirical. I think someone might make that argument. But the product at the end of the day is an idea. So, for example, let's talk about the square root. I guess, is that an empirical determination? I'm already immediately thinking, I can see someone making the argument that it is. This would be a tough one to go down, I guess, to debate this kind of thing. The person might say, well, in the real world, there's four things. The square root of 4 is 2 times 2. And so that's kind of an empirical observation. But the identification of singular things, is that empirical? Or is that something that we're doing with the mind? Are we assuming that this is an instance here? So, 4 marshmallows, right? Each marshmallow is a clump of atoms. So, how do I know it's one? rather than many. I mean, it's many different atoms. So the many different atoms, you might say, are, it's not one, it's plural. So to create a singularity in each one is something from the mind, I might say. So the idea of one is an idea. It's not empirical. Moreover, though, and this is really what I want to stress, I can do all this stuff closing my eyes. Let's imagine I'm blind and I've never seen anything in my life. I could potentially imagine these things. Right? I could produce the image of a circle in my mind. Or let's, if you want to get technical, let's say that I had the ability to see at one point and I went blind later. So I'm familiar with the idea of visualizing, and I get good at visualizing new things. So if I can visualize new things that have never existed, right? I can create a shape, like start with a circle maybe, and then bend that circle around and make it so bizarre that I'm inventing a new shape. Okay, so now I've created an instance of a thing in my mind. And I'm going to call this thing something not too complicated. I'm trying to make a new word here. Linny. How about that? Does that work? Linny? Is that? I hope that's not, that word's never been used before, but we'll call it a linny. All right. So if I can create a linny in the mind. So it's an idea existing in the mind that doesn't exist in the material world, and now I can determine a category for it. I can maybe define it by its shape. I can give it all sorts of other features if I wanted to as well. But I'm creating a definition for this linny that exists inside the mind. So I guess what I'm trying to argue is that categorization is not empirical. These things can exist in the mind, and in fact, all I'm doing when I'm making an empirical judgment is I'm taking things that I've seen, turning them into ideas, and then translating those ideas into these categories. But the categories are non-physical. That's really what I want to emphasize. We're talking about a non-material thing. So I don't think science or empiricism is about these non-material things. Now, someone may argue that with me, I guess, and I guess that's fine. But I don't think that's what the modern empiricist is trying to argue. These ideas in the mind are not acquired through empiricism. They're a priori, existing in the mind only, and that's all that's necessary. That's all. That's all that's necessary is to have them existing in the mind. So if we're dealing with the realm of ideas, not the realm of the material world, we're not making empirical determinations. Okay. Is the determination of a category discovered through experiment? So do you make an experiment and then you discover a category through an experiment? If the answer is yes, tell me how. If the answer to that is yes, tell me how. How do you discover not the instance of an apple, but the category of apple using experiment? Now, someone might be able to come up with an experiment to show that an object belongs to a certain category, but you haven't constructed the category itself through an experiment. What does an experiment do? Right? So it just measures the causal relationship between two variables, independent variable and dependent variable. That's what an experiment does. And that's the only thing an experiment does. That is the only thing the experiment does. It does not discover categories. So you cannot create an experiment that discovers a category. In fact, if you're going to use categories in your experiment, which you are bound to do, in fact, so this is very interesting too, is that the scientists are using categories. They have to determine the category prior to the experiment. So if you're going to say something like, for example, watching TV makes people happy or makes people not happy, whatever. What you're going to do is you're going to measure the relationship between TV and happiness. But these are these categories exist before the experiment exists. TV is a category that you've determined before you've actually done the experiment. Happiness is a category you've determined before you've done the experiment. So the experiment does not discover the existence of TVs, and it does not discover the existence of happiness. Happiness is a category. Scientific experiment cannot figure that out. It cannot discover a category, whether a category exists or not. That's beyond scientific experiment. When do we learn categories then? So we learn categories in kindergarten, first grade. Sesame Street, right? TV shows like Sesame Street. We learn words and definitions in English class. That's where we learn this stuff. So we learn this stuff. It's a really basic thing. I kind of walked through it with you already. How you do it, you find the definition of the category, find the definition of the particulars, match. Pretty simple stuff. We learned it when we were kids. We learned it from watching Sesame Street, from watching Big Bird. So, here's my claim. Categorization is not science. Taxonomy, which is the study of how to categorize things, that's not science. Science is a scientific experiment. There's nothing about this stuff that is unique to the scientific study. The methods being used in science for categorization are the same methods we've used in English class or in philosophy class. There's no difference. So it's no better than English or philosophy. It deserves no special deference. These methods are no different than Sesame Street. Therefore, when a scientist comes up with a category, we should give it as much credence as we would to a category proposed by Big Bird. This is interesting because we're not doing that. We are treating scientific categories as if there's something to be respected here, like there's elevated because they're using a method that is so perfectly guaranteed. Well, they're not using the scientific method. I understand our fascination with the scientific method. Sure, and I went over that in the previous discussion. It's not as fascinating as people may think it is. It certainly has done a lot for society. So I understand if you want to elevate the scientific method to some degree, but you don't need to be elevating scientific categorization because that is no different than Big Bird. All right. That's my proposition for today. We'll go more into this in the later discussions, especially when we look at the DSM-5. My name is Artie Zeradar, and thanks for watching the Artie Zeradar Show. Before I go, I just forgot. I want to try to have in each episode some sort of deduction of the day. I may not always have a deduction of the day, but I'd like to try my best to do that. So I'd like to leave you with the deduction of the day. So I'm going to do a 3-premise deduction today. The major premise in this case, or I guess the first premise in this case is non-material things do not belong to science. Premise 2, ideas belong to non-material things. Premise 3, categories belong to ideas. Therefore, conclusion, categories do not belong to science. And I'll leave you with that to think about. Have a good day.